Good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. I welcome you to the 6th annual workshop of the Community of Practice of Scaling Up. My name is Johannes Lin, and I'm the co-chair of the Scaling Community of Practice together with Larry Cooley. Since many of you are not familiar with the Scaling Community of Practice, I assume, since you're newcomers to our forum, I would like to briefly explain what we're all about. But to start with, I need to say that today's session of the 12 sessions that we've organized in our annual workshop this year, this session is about climate change, and it is organized by the Climate Change Working Group of the Community of Practice. And I'm delighted that we have the opportunity to discuss this topic today, just after COP26 finished. And of course, we'll be discussing the outcomes of this very important event in a minute. Now, as I said, some of you may not be familiar with the Community of Practice on Scaling. Let me briefly explain to you what it is. It's completely voluntary and free of charge. It is dedicated to advancing and professionalizing the practice of scaling by learning across sectors and geographies and perspectives. In addition to this annual workshop that we run every October and November in the year, the Community of Practice issues quarterly newsletters and operates 9 working groups that explore scaling through the lens of various sectors and thematic issues. The Climate Change Working Group is one of the 9 groups. And each group has a web page on the website of the Community of Practice. As you'll see in the chat, I hope my colleagues from MSI will put in the information. The address for the website is www.scalingcommunityofpractice.com. If you want to know more about the Community of Practice, you should feel free, please, to reach out to us at scalingcop@msi-inc.com. So let me thank you again for joining us today. Let's turn then to today's session. I will close in a minute with my introductory comments, but just want to mention a few housekeeping remarks. First, this session is being recorded. Please mute your microphone when you're not speaking, and also please turn off your video screen when you're not speaking. Place your comments and questions in the chat box at any time, and our moderators will keep track as best as possible. We expect quite a few, given that we have quite a lot of you attending today. By the way, we're delighted with the large response we had to our invitation. With this as background, let me introduce the co-chairs of the Climate Change Working Group who organized today's session and who will moderate it. It's my pleasure that my good friend and colleague from many years, Amar Bhattacharya, is with us today. Amar is a senior fellow at the Brookings Institution, has a very distinguished career with the World Bank, but also with other important organizations and challenges. I'm also welcoming George Zedganidze. George is the head of knowledge and change management at the Green Climate Fund. He also has an extraordinarily accomplished career. You'll find the details for both of them on the workshop page in terms of their backgrounds. So with this, again, I welcome you all. Let me hand then over the microphone to George, who will introduce session and also will introduce our distinguished speakers, to whom I'm especially grateful that they are joining us today. Thank you, and handing over to George. George, the word is yours.
Thank you, Johannes. Thank you so much for the kind introduction. And again, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everybody. I am George Zedganidze, and I will be moderating today's meeting together with Amar Bhattacharya. Amar, given his great involvement in the recently concluded COP26 in Glasgow, has kindly accepted being part of the speaker panel as well. Thanks, Amar, for that. Our meeting today takes place right after COP26 and puts us in a highly favorable position for discussing fresh outcomes from the COP26 and the way ahead of us. What can we expect in the upcoming future? How can we scale up climate finance and investments for delivering on the targets? The event will be structured in two main sessions. The first session, moderated by myself, will have 4 speakers and will focus on reflections from COP26, its outcomes, issues, and ways forward. The second session will be moderated by Amar and will have a presentation by Yannick Lemarek, the Executive Director of the Green Climate Fund, and also one of the co-founders of this working group of the Scaling Up Community of Practice on Climate Change. His presentation will be on new perspectives on climate innovations and investments. It will be followed by a moderated discussion in which participants will have a chance to ask questions and provide comments and thoughts. In our first session today, we're fortunate to have 4 very distinguished speakers. And I first briefly present them, giving the floor one by one for their remarks. I'm happy to present the first speaker, Amalie Amin. Amalie joined CDC as Climate Change Director within the Value Creation Strategies team on February in 2020. Previously, Amalie worked for the Inter-American Development Bank, where she was Chief of Climate Change. Prior joining to IDB, Amalie spent 10 years working on sustainable energy and climate change within the UK government, including the Cabinet Office, Department for Environment, Food and Rural Affairs, Department for Energy and Climate Change, and Foreign Office. At CDC, Amalie plays a pivotal role in leading the climate change team and implementing the strategy. She was greatly involved in the COP26 conference on climate change, and it will be very interesting to hear her views on this. By way of introduction, I will also introduce Amar, the co-chair of this working group, who is also the panelist. He's a senior fellow at the Center for Sustainable Development, housed in the Global Economy and Development Program at the Brookings. He has had a long and very successful career actively participating in global economy discussions and has held positions at the World Bank as a director of the Group of 24, an intergovernmental group of developing country finance ministers and central bank governors. He brings expertise in global economy, development finance, global governance, and the links between climate and development. With this, I would like to invite Amalie and Amar to please take the floor and share their views and reflections on COP26 and their key takeaways. After our first two presentations, I will then introduce our the other two presenters, Yannick Lemarek and Lord Nicholas Stern. So over to you, Amalie, please.
Thank you. Sorry, I think I was on mute. Yes, I've unmuted myself, hopefully. And good to see you, George. It's been quite a while since I last saw you. I think maybe in Songdo was probably last time we saw each other some time ago. And of course, always a pleasure to be having a discussion and joining a panel with Amar on issues, particularly on finance and climate finance issues. So I think, looking at what came out of Glasgow, we need to think about the outcomes in what I would say maybe 3 main dimensions. I think critically there was the importance for ensuring that existing commitments are being delivered. We know that the 100 billion by 2020 was not delivered, and in Glasgow there was a mea culpa by the developed countries to where they expressed deep regret in the text about that. In addition, there was a delivery plan that actually had been published before Glasgow, setting out how the 100 billion will be delivered over the next few years, with signalling that certainly by 2023, although it is hoped that perhaps the 100 billion commitment could be delivered in 2022. So, we obviously wait to see what happens there. The other area that was increasingly important for the most vulnerable countries, which we know the less developed countries, the small island developing states in particular, was the need to increase accessibility to climate finance, and particularly for adaptation resiliency measures. And this was a key concern, and something that I think Glasgow has gone some way to addressing. There is now an agreement to doubling of adaptation finance, taking 2019 as the base year, which was actually quite a good year for adaptation finance, but also the first year that it had been brought out separately in terms of the numbers, and to double that by 2025, with many hoping it will be before. So that was definitely something that was seen as welcomed by the most vulnerable countries in particular. But I do think this issue of accessibility as well to those resources is an area that is going to need further work. And actually, there is quite a lot of interesting language in the Glasgow text around that, as well as some very interesting language around how basically along the lines of prioritising grant funding and highly concessional resource for adaptation, not exclusively, because we know that will be needed as well, particularly when we think about the mobilisation agenda. Maybe that's, the second area that I think is was very significant when we look at finance in Glasgow, that is less to do with the negotiated outcomes, but more specifically to do with many of the announcements and initiatives and coalitions that have been coming together. So we probably one of the biggest headlines was this announcement by the Glasgow Finance Alliance for Net Zero, that represent $130 trillion of assets under management, where they have now said and committed to be net zero by 2050. And so very clear indications that the trillions are now looking to align with the Paris Agreement. I would say that commitment, or that announcement, because it's not really a commitment, or it's a commitment for net zero, but I think that really only becomes meaningful if those trillions actually start to get to where they're most needed to deliver on net zero and climate resilient development, particularly in developing and emerging markets. And so the announcement that was made, in fact, just the day before that, by the South African government with the UK, US, Germany, France, and European Commission for a new partnership around supporting and working with South Africa and relevant stakeholders to deliver a just energy transition for South Africa, recognizing the billions and potentially even hundreds of billions that will be needed to enable South Africa to accelerate a phase out of coal, transition out of coal into clean energy, but also very importantly, to ensure that there are resources available to support the just transition dimension of that, particularly for workers and communities that will be affected by the phase out of coal. So particular coal mining areas, as well as coal powered generation facilities. And so that, I think, was a very significant signal, if you like, of a new type of partnership. A partnership that represents, that will take place over at least 10 years, maybe longer, that will really look at, that will really focus on delivering the different resources that are going to be needed to enable this just energy transition in South Africa. So those, I think, and then there were various other initiatives launched, bringing different stakeholders together. Philanthropists, very active. We're seeing a lot of interesting initiatives being led and contributed to by the philanthropic sector, which I think can bring very complementary resource to that of development finance and that of private sector finance. So I think, a whole bundle of new interesting initiatives. And then I would say just the third main area is what is the forward process around climate finance, and what is the new goal, if you like, post 2025. And there actually a process has been established. It's I think a very looks like an ambitious and credible process. A senior, well, a combination of an ad hoc work program that includes a number of workshops, including with input of technical experts from the whole range of expertise, including from the private sector, which I think is probably the first time we've seen that clearly. Not just acknowledged, but also requested that inputs from private sector and development finance, multilateral development banks, that those are being asked to input into the considerations around the new goal. And also some very interesting calls on particularly the multilateral development banks, as well as also looking at reference to the use of special drawing rights, which, as we know, there's already been an agreement around a new resilience and sustainability trust fund at the IMF, which could be a very significant source of funding for countries, particularly on adaptation, and potentially supporting some of the issues that we know were being asked for in terms of a loss and damage agenda, particularly looking at macroeconomic implications of climate disasters, for example. So really interesting, I think, that the forward-looking process now under the UNFCCC is very clearly, and I think probably clearly for the first time, reaching out and engaging, asking for engagement and inputs from what I would call real economy actors and the real financial sector in both public and private. And I think this is a very significant step forward. There is now, of course, a lot of work to be done. None of this is finalised or agreed, but I do feel that there is a very good basis now to actually create post 2025 climate finance goal and framework that really incentivizes the actions and actors across the real economy to ensure that all finance now is consistent with what countries have committed to do under the Paris Agreement.
Okay, just making sure you're not.
No, hopefully you could hear me. I did see someone said that my volume was low, but I
can hear you all right.
Okay, good. Okay, good. I'm never sure with this mic. If I put it too close, it gets too loud, but okay, great.
It was not only we could hear you clearly, but it was very engaging and insightful, and thank you so much for that. With this, I invite Amar to please come in, and we will then take the next speakers. Thank you.
Thank you, George. Can you hear me clearly? Yep. I just want to make sure I'm loud and I'm clear. Yes. Okay. All right. Okay. Yeah. Thank you. So it's always a pleasure to follow Amelie. Amelie was very much in the nerve center of COP26. It was a real pleasure working with her intensively during the past 2 weeks and seeing her face to face after a long time. I was there very much with Lord Nicholas Stern, who will be speaking later. Given that the two of them are really well positioned to cover, what actually transpired in COP26 and the agenda ahead, I thought my comparative advantage in this on this panel would be to link the climate change agenda really to what this community of practice is, which is scaling up. Limiting climate change has been called by my colleague Kemal Dervis as the mother of all global public goods, and has become undoubtedly the most important challenge for global governance. Runaway climate change would destroy the planet. Mitigation to prevent it is an archetypal GPG in that it is non-rivalrous and non-excludable, meaning that the reduction of greenhouse gas concentrations in the atmosphere is achieved by one country does not impinge on the amounts affecting any other country, and no country impinges on the amounts affecting mitigation anywhere else. This means that in countries working individually will not be able to produce the optimal result. And that's a very important aspect of scaling up in this agenda. And second, those that have perhaps put the least amount of carbon in the atmosphere are likely to be the most affected. And that's an important framing that we need to keep in mind when we think about the scaling up agenda for climate action. Now, in that context, I want to talk about 4 dimensions of scaling up and the challenges and the opportunities, in some sense, opened up by COP26. So the first is cooperation around ambition. And you may have seen that there was a tremendous amount of discussion around the net zero target. Will the world reach net zero emissions by 2050? Why is that important? Because it's only with that and the pathways to that net zero that we would limit global warming to 1.5 degrees, which is now considered the goalpost. 2 degrees is simply not good enough. The world has to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees. Implicit in that statement is a complex task of the allocation of the limited carbon budget that the world has. How is that to be allocated? If China remains at the present level, at its present level, it would eat up pretty much 75% of the carbon budget. Even if the European Union and the US limit their emissions, they would eat up a very large share of the carbon budget. So in the scaling up agenda here, a complex task is the allocation of this limited carbon budget. Recognize that the developing countries who have contributed the least, of course, have the biggest needs going forward. So in the scaling up agenda, ambition really means, ensuring that we have a cooperative solution to the carbon budget issue. Second, on the other side, and Yannick will talk much more about that, the solution lies in investment and innovation. Investment allows us to do things differently and replace bad capital with better capital. And innovation allows us to get ahead of the game, in some sense benefiting from reductions in costs and new opportunities. And at COP26, one of the exciting things that happened was the discussions around what was called the breakthrough agendas. As Amelie said, breakthrough on power, breakthrough on road transport, on steel, on hydrogen, agriculture, new areas. And the proposition is that you can do some things in a way that allow you to leapfrog. Why is that important? 80% of the infrastructure and physical capital of the developing world in 2050 has still to be built. That is the scaling up proposition. And if you did it in a better and different way, it's not just about climate, it's about better and new forms of growth. So we have tremendous opportunity through investment and innovation to scale up, to avoid the climate problem, and to deliver on development. So doing that means doing it at the country level. Whereas, so it's something where there is no conflict, as it were, in terms of what you do for development and what you do for climate, and that's where the focus has to be. The third is the centrality of policy, of course. We are unable to do what we need to do because oftentimes most countries find it difficult to come forward with the investment programs at scale for system transformation. We do project at a time sometimes, but what is necessary here from the scaling perspective is system transformation. System transformation in energy, supply and demand side, system transformation in sustainable transport, in water, in digital infrastructure, in agriculture. We have to transform the systems. So scaling up here really means taking a very, very different approach to what we have taken in the past. Second aspect of policy, of course, is the famous carbon pricing, because it taxes the externality that is the problem. And where we are is we have a very low average price of carbon across the world, and only 20% of emissions of the world is covered by some form of a carbon price. So a central aspect of the agenda right now, correctly, is the elimination of fossil fuel subsidies, which is negative carbon pricing, and putting in place a regime on carbon pricing. You will hear a lot of discussion now going forward around carbon leakage, meaning what happens when some countries push forward on carbon pricing and others don't, around cross-border price adjustments. And Germany has put forward a proposal around a carbon club that in some sense ensures cooperation, but also a regime that in some sense addresses the free rider problem. But carbon pricing itself is not enough. We have other market failures, and we have opportunities through use of other instruments, standards, for example, energy standards, setting targets for the phase out, for example, of internal combustion engines, land use, urban planning. All of these are very important, and we need to understand better how these can be used together to again scale up system transformation. The last area, and Amalie talked about it at length, is the importance of finance. So let me put that from the scaling perspective. If you look at the amount of investment that we will require in the next 3 decades, it is really the investment that is needed now to ensure the sustainability of the planet and to deliver the development goals from the perspective of convergence. 5.6 billion people live in emerging markets and developing countries other than China. We will add 2 billion more people to that group of countries in the next 30 years. Addressing the development challenge during this period will be critical. Addressing the climate will make that development sustainable and the planet sustainable. So we have to find a way to get the finance for the scale of investment that we need. Our numbers show that you need about $1 trillion additional by as soon as 2025, and probably $2 trillion more to undertake the kinds of transformations that we are talking about, and that's excluding the Human Development Agenda. So we have to find finance at scale. We think about half of it can come from domestic resource mobilization. There is a scaling up agenda there, but as Amalie was saying, there's also a scaling up agenda with regard to international public and private finance. On the public side, we will need significant amounts of concessional finance, especially for poor and vulnerable countries, especially for risk capital. We have tremendous opportunity to finance system in 2 ways. We need to scale up the multilateral concessional funds, including the GCF. The GCF is doing a very good job, but it needs to perhaps be 2 or 3 times the size it is, if it is to play the systemic role that it could play. And we need to scale up the multilateral development banks as well as bilateral development finance in a big way. Nick Stern and I have put out a note on the possible way to move forward in international public finance, but scaling up is absolutely important and using all pools of finance most effectively. Last, as Amalie said, we have now a tremendous potential from the private sector. We always talk about the supply side, but I think it is important to begin first with the demand side opportunities. When you look at these transitions that I am talking about, the private sector now can play a much bigger role. In the South Africa case that Amalie mentioned, 2/3 of the investment now can be made by the private sector, especially in generation of renewable energy, but also on demand side aspects like green hydrogen, building efficiency, energy efficiency, buildings, and indeed transformation of the whole economy. So the private sector opportunity also means that we can utilize much better private sector finance. But for emerging markets and developing countries, we face two challenges. One is risk premia and cost of capital. And second is we need finance that is really long term. The perfect match is to get institutional capital, patient capital that is indeed long term, and get them to invest in emerging markets and developing countries. As Amalie mentioned, there is 130 trillion of institutional capital that has come forward and that has committed to net zero by 2050, and that is committed to investing in emerging markets and developing countries. How much of that money right now is invested in emerging markets and developing countries? The answer is close to zero. So there is a tremendous potential for scaling up, but it will only happen if there's a partnership between the public and the private sector. So let me close on the last aspect of scaling up, and this is something that Isabel Guerrero had very much highlighted last year, and that is the importance of partnerships. This, what happens in the negotiating room is very important, but as we saw at Glasgow, the partnership now is really much, much broader. It was striking in Glasgow that it was the private sector that was in the lead. It was striking that the business sector was coming forward with all these innovative solutions that I was talking about. The engagement of civil society, the engagement of global citizenry. So climate is just too important an issue. And if we are to get the kind of pressure, but also the cooperation that we need that broad-based engagement. Thank you, George.
Thank you, Amar. Thank you very much for a very insightful intervention. And I will move on with introducing our next two presenters. As I said earlier, we have interventions from Yannick Lemarek and Lord Nicholas Stern. And we will then take some questions at that point. I'm delighted to introduce now Yannick Lemarek, Executive Director of the Green Climate Fund. Yannick has 30 years or over 30 years of international experience in climate change, development and finance and their interrelationships. He served as UN Assistant Secretary General and Deputy Executive Director for Policy and Program in United Nations Women from 2015 to 2018, overseeing services provided by close to 2,000 UN Women staff in over 80 countries worldwide. Before joining UN Women, he was Executive Coordinator of UN Multi-Partner Trust Fund Office in New York from 2013 to the beginning of 15. He was responsible for the design and administration of about 100 UN trust funds, supporting humanitarian, post-conflict development and climate action in over 100 countries. Yannick is also a co-founder of this working group of scaling up climate change. Let me also introduce our fourth panelist, and I'm pleased to now introduce Lord Nicholas Stern, who has agreed to participate once again in our annual COP event after his remarkable participation last year with Yannick Lemarek. It is a pleasure to have you back, Nick. Lord Stern is IG Petal Professor of Economics and Government, Chairman of the Grantham Research Institute on Climate Change and Environment, and head of the India Observatory of the London School of Economics. President of the British Academy, July 2013 to 17, and was elected Fellow of the Royal Society in 2014. He was Chief Economist of the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development in 1994 to 1999, and Chief Economist and Senior Vice President at the World Bank. He was second permanent secretary to Her Majesty's Treasury from 2003 to 2005, and Director of Policy and Research for the Prime Minister's Commission for Africa, Head of Stern Review of the Economics and Climate Change publication in 2006, and Head of Government Economic Services in 2003 to 2007. He was knighted for services to economics in 2004, made a cross-bench life peer as Baron Stern of Brentford in 2007, and appointed Companion of Honor for services to the Economics International Relationship in Tackling Climate Change in 2017. Having published more than 15 books and 100 articles, Lord Stern research in public focus on economic and climate change, economic development and growth, economic change theory, tax reform, public policy, role of the state in economies in transition. We're very grateful to have you here once again. And I know these are very brief summaries of Yannick's and Lord Stern's bios. So I hope you will forgive if I have missed many more achievements you both have in your careers. But with this brief introduction, over to you, Yannick, and we will then invite Lord Stern after your remarks. Thank you.
Thank you very much, George. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to participants, depending on your geographic location. A few words on COP26. I will try to keep my remarks short because I will have another opportunity to speak later during this meeting. We went to COP26 with three major gaps: an emission gap, an adaptation gap, and a finance gap. And we were at risk of getting out of COP26 with a fourth gap, a trust gap. A trust gap from developing countries vis-à-vis developed countries, because the $100 billion would not, committed at Copenhagen would not have been delivered, but also a trust gap from OECD countries vis-à-vis the UNFCCC process. That will not have delivered the emission ambitions thought after, and therefore the risks that we move toward alternative solutions such as border carbon tax adjustment. And so for me, it was very much what was at stake at COP26, making sure that we start closing the three gaps and we do not open a fourth gap. Now, regarding the first gap, depending on the targets, depending on the success matrix you adopt, we are at the end of COP26. We have basically either reduce the emission gap to an extent where we are now on a trajectory for 1.8 degrees Celsius in increased average global temperature, or we have made next to no differences, and we are at 2.7 degrees Celsius, or even worse, 3.1 degrees Celsius. And so it's fairly unusual to get out of a conference where basically, depending on the commentator, we are on a pathway anywhere between 1.8 degrees Celsius and 3.1 degrees Celsius. All of us here are part of this conference because we want to make sure that we are on a 1.8 degrees Celsius, and if possible, lower next year. But for that, it will very much depend on whether or not the net zero emission targets that have been announced by countries accounting for 70% of the emissions are to be realized or not. Realizing these net zero emission targets will require a dramatic increase in investment and investment in a different type of assets. Including the creation of new asset classes. Now, the second gap, the adaptation gap. On the positive side, there was at COP26 a recognition that the days where we could have averted catastrophic climate change simply through an energy transition are over. Climate change is not something that might happen in the near future. It's something that has been with us for at least 20 years. When James Hansen was said in the 80s that we will see the first sign of climate change at the turn of the millennium, he was taken for an alarmist. Now, 19 out of the 20 warmest years on record have taken place since the turn of the millennium. And if you look at the budget stability, the budget deficits of a number of countries, of the most vulnerable countries, the most important thing, no, it's basically whether or not they are to be hit by a hurricane or another climate-related extreme weather event. And so it was very important that there was this recognition that we need to scale up adaptation efforts as much as mitigation effort. It's good that there was a commitment to double the money that is going to adaptation right now, but it's important to keep in mind that the money that is going to adaptation right now is extremely low. And there was a major call for grant funding for adaptation. We will have to invest in anywhere between $1 to $4 trillion of climate resilient, low emission infrastructures annually by 2030, and this could increase to $3 to $6 trillion annually by 2040. So we are definitely not speaking about something that is to be financing grant. And for me, the call for grants reflects another major issue. The fact that for a number of countries, COVID-19 it was not only a humanitarian catastrophe, it's become an economic disaster, it's become a fiscal crisis and a debt crisis. And the reason why people are asking for grant is because we are completely maxed up in terms of sovereign debts. And for me, it's important to understand this, and we know that grant will not basically come with finance the $1.4 trillion of climate resilient infrastructure we need. And so for me, this should be seen as a call for looking at other type of non-grant instruments in addition to sovereign debt, such as guarantees and private equities, to be able to catalyze finance at scale. Now coming to finance, the financing gap was very much $100 billion. We were at 80 in 2019, according to OECD. This definitely created a lot of bad blood in terms of negotiation. It will be critical to ensure that we do not end up with a trust gap at COP27 to come very close to this $100 billion. But this will be also extremely important to come with a reasonable approach, to a credible approach, to make sure that we can use this $100 billion in a catalytic manner to shift $1 to $4 trillion annually. On paper, it should not be impossible, because if only 2% of the $130 trillion that have committed to align their operation to climate change were to be redirected towards these new asset classes, climate resilient, low emission infrastructure in developing countries, the math should square. But this is not happening. And that will be the main topic of my presentation after, why it's not happening. And so our collective challenge as a community of practice is to make sure that by COP26, we have a number of very tangible example about how we can use $100 billion in a catalytic manner to scale up finance to the level of $1 to $4 trillion.
Thank you very much.
I will maybe stop here because I will have another opportunity to speak, George.
Indeed. We will in the second session have a presentation that you have kindly agreed to give. And now we will move to the next intervention. So Lord Stern, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, and my apologies for not being able to join you at the beginning and having to leave it a little early. Not surprisingly, I'm very much on the same page as Yannick in the assessment of COP26. It was remarkable how far we got, and it's even more remarkable how far we have to go. But both those statements are correct. And what I want to do is to take the spirit of scale that we're trying to grapple with in this meeting and offer some remarks first on scale in terms of the changes and advances in the way we understand the issues and how big they are. Secondly, in terms of the players who are now involved, particularly at COP26, but it's a reflection of more generally in achieving that scale. And then lastly, opening the discussion of what we have to do to get that scale. And I'm sure that Amar and Yannick and Amali either have already come in or will come in on what we have to do to get the scale. But first, I think it's very important that we recognize the change in understanding, the deepening of understanding in these last several years, particularly since Paris. And of course, Paris was a hugely important step forward, a landmark in all this. But we've moved strongly since Paris. Paris, was summarized as well below 2 degrees as the target and efforts towards 1.5. We've had a real shift and in the understanding that this is now 1.5. And that itself is a major step on the scale of what we have to do. There's a huge difference between 2 degrees and 1.5, as we know, in terms of impact, but there's a huge difference also in what we have to do to get there. So that move from well below 2 to 1.5 as the central objectives is itself a huge increase in scale. The expression in terms of net zero was actually there in Paris because there is language about the balancing of sources and sinks. But the language of net zero itself, I think, has increased people's recognition of the scale of what they have to do. Back when we did the Stern Review and really almost all the way up to Paris, people's targets were 80% reductions 1990 to 2050. And they appealed to the science, but the science was a bit mysterious. Well, why 80%? But then as soon as you say net zero, you understand it because that stabilizes concentrations and you need to stabilize concentrations to stabilize temperatures. So the reason for it comes through very strongly. It's basic physics. And also people realize that they can all do it. And indeed, since the negatives are unlikely to be huge, we'll make them as big as we can, of course, but since they're unlikely to be huge, net zero applies to everybody. So that concept of net zero was itself enhancing the scale. We all have to move from where we are now down to net zero. And it's a scale story because it involves everybody. And so I think the 1.5 and the net zero, which have really come to us since Paris, even though technically net zero in other language was in Paris, is, I think, hugely important in terms of scale and, of course, in terms of urgency. I think the scale of the adaptation challenge since Paris has really deepened, and Yannick quite rightly emphasized that. We've recognized scale also in that this isn't just about kilograms of greenhouse gases. This is also about the environment, the biodiversity, the ecosystems in which we live. And that, I think, has enhanced the scale and our understanding of what we have to do. I think it's enriched our understanding of what we have to do, but that, I think, is an important advance and genuinely much, much stronger since Paris. I think the next thing I'd underline in terms of understanding in relation to scale is that more and more countries, more and more people are understanding that this drive to net zero is the growth story of the 21st century. Growth in the good sense of growth and development as, for example, assessed through the Sustainable Development Goals. And that it will be full of innovation, discovery, investment, and it will be enriching across a whole range of dimensions. I mean, many of you will have noticed that essentially Delhi has been closed in this last day or so because you can't breathe. Now, that whole story of what we get beyond simply, it's very important, of course, but beyond simply the reduced risks of climate disruption is, I think, very important. So in terms of the dynamics of the investment, the new growth story, the meaning of the new growth story, how much we have to invest to get there, which is a lot. And Yannick gave numbers absolutely in the right ballpark there. So that understanding that this is a big story of growth. It's not a narrow, just kick out the emissions. It's a new story of growth. It's a very attractive one, but we have to invest a lot to get there. That again, I think, is something that has really accelerated in the last 5 years and very visible in Glasgow. And of course, Glasgow had the Glasgow breakthroughs in technology with very strong ambition and big sign up across a whole range of countries, including in various ways China, India, EU, and the US, and many more countries, of course, around power and transport and steel and hydrogen. Really quite ambitious goals, roughly speaking, saying that by 2030, in all these areas, the green should be the cheap, yeah? Or inexpensive, as they say in the United States. That, I think, also was a big expansion of the scale of competitiveness of the green technologies. We know, of course, in power that in many parts of the world, round the clock, renewables are already cheaper than the dirty fossil alternatives. But I think the Glasgow breakthroughs expanded the scale of that story as well. So I think if you look at the understandings in Glasgow, if you look at where we were 5-6 years ago, I think those understandings will lead us very strongly to greater scale, and I think for the support for the greater scale. Very quickly now, that's really the main story I wanted to emphasize. But let me just emphasize scale in terms of the people who were there. Now, I've been to all the COPs since 2006. I'm sure there are people on this call who've been to all of the COPs, much more than I have. And since I've been to 15, and this was the first one where the private sector and the finance were right out in front and now pulling governments along. And that's extremely important. This was one of the few where the presidents and prime ministers were there in very large numbers. That was true of Paris, of course, but it hasn't been true of many. It was true in Copenhagen, but of course they got them along there at the end, not the beginning, which was a mistake. But the presence of the, 100 and I've forgotten the latest count, but 120 something heads of governments, that's a scale story. Also, and very importantly, the Coalition of Finance Ministers on Climate Action, in which Amar and I have been very active, that had a very strong meeting there in Glasgow. And now we have, this is beyond the finance, beyond the environment ministers. It has to be, of course, the nature of the subject. It has to have the finance and economy ministers, but they were there in force, and Janet Yellen and Rishi Sunak, and and of course the heads of the IMF and the World Bank. They were all there for that coalition of finance ministers, and the big companies were there in force. They now recognize that they have to be there. They have to be there for their own reputation, but they have to be there to understand what's going on. And the world's biggest companies were there and talking to each other. So I think we've got that notion of scale in terms of who's involved. And of course, we had the Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero declaring, 130 trillion, pointing in the direction of net zero. That's roughly half, close to half, the world's assets under management. And it's not going to be, people's sincerity varies. I'm not going to point any fingers, but even if half of that is sincere, it's still a very large number. I suspect actually it's more than half, that they recognize that these are the investments of the future. The investments of the 19th and 20th century are not going to be very good investments. But also, to be fair, I think they recognize it as their duty to do it. When profitability and duty coincide, well, that's a force for good. So the final point, and I'm sure that Amar is going to develop this, is that a big worry about achieving the scale is whether the country platforms and the policies and the investment climate are going to be right to unleash the investment behind which those big pools of private money can come. That's a big task, and it's a task in which Of course, governments themselves have to lead, but the private sector should lead also, because they are obviously particularly knowledgeable in the circumstances into which they can invest, and they have to be part of that story. And of course, the multilateral development institutions should be very much part of that story, as well as creating the environment which can draw through the very big investments that we need. And then the right kind of finance in the right place at the right time. And Amar and I did a paper which got some traction in Glasgow on beyond the 100 billion. 100 billion has to be delivered fast without moving the goalposts. It's a question of trust, as Yannick quite rightly emphasized. But the sums we're talking about are way beyond that. And of course, different forms of finance have different roles in all this. And it's a mistake to aggregate them all together. We have to, I'm sure Amar will set them out, and we have to think of numbers for them. But it's a bigger story, and it's a more disaggregated story, because different kinds of finance do different jobs. Concessionary finance is very important for some parts, including the just transition. Taking risk is another part of the story. The finance has those many dimensions, and getting it right really matters, and getting the scale really matters. And my last point would be that unless we move fast on finance, we will block ambition, because many countries will say, yes, we're ready for the ambition, but we need to see the finance. So that's it from me. Apologies if I've restated things that other people have stated, but let's regard that as agreement and emphasis.
Thank you so much. Thank you to both of you for your great insights, and it was, as usual, very interesting. At this point, we've had all 4 interventions made, and we would like to use the remaining few minutes to take a few questions from the floor. Questions to Lord Stern, Yannick, Amar, or Amalie. We still have all 4 of them around, so this would be the right time to pose any questions. So could you please raise your hand? That would be the easiest way for us to moderate this Q&A. If there are any questions on the floor.
I see a hand, Yannick, George,
Yeah.
but is
Natasha, Natasha, if your connection is good, would you mind taking the floor, please, in stating your question? Natasha, can you unmute yourself? Okay, we'll move to the next one. Freddie, please, and then we'll come back to Natasha in a minute.
Can you hear me okay?
Very low. Could you turn up the volume?
Hi. This week's Climate Action Chapter's assessment of pledges and targets at COP26 reveals that if these hit mainly as aspirational measures, a target of 2.7 degrees in 2100 is probable, perhaps 2.4 C at the best. Yet pleas from the IEA, massive nuclear projects, again went unanswered. As this sector is a robust bridge to reduce temperatures, will the GCF be funding any nuclear power generation infrastructure in the 22-23 calendar or beyond?
Thank you, Freddie. We have registered your question. Donna, please, we'll take a few questions and then we'll ask the panel to respond.
Hi, thanks for the discussion and the talk. I'm Donna Harris from Oxford Policy Management and University of Oxford. I typed in my question as well that, you know, as a behavioral economist, there's a lot of issues around behavioral biases when it comes to ensuring that commitments are honored. And I think from the COP, not only this year, but previous years as well, we have seen that there have been many commitments made, but not necessarily honored or, you know, followed. So just wondering, you know, in terms of thinking about designing both for Yannick and all the speakers, actually, Lord Stern as well, in thinking about designing commitment device, you know, an agreement to ensure that there is some repercussions, some kind of behavioral biases, you know, consideration included in these commitments or these agreements. Have there been any discussions around this issue?
Thank you, Donna. We'll take come back to Natasha if you would like to take the floor.
Yes, I would like to know more about scaling up projects such as investing in projects such as more tech advanced projects that would help climate warming and in funding in a more advanced technical technology in climate projects, climate action projects such as hydro and more in such as more experimental projects that could be used to sorry, I'm talking too fast, to reduce the climate reduce the climate and to reduce the climate and to in oceans and to reduce climate emissions.
Sure. Natasha, thank you for that question. I think we got the gist of it. Maybe we can also, you know, talk a little bit in our responses on different types of interventions and projects. Thank you for that.
Yes.
I will also like to maybe read a couple of questions from the chat, and we'll turn the microphone to the panel so that panelists can respond. So we won't be able to read all of them, but maybe we can read a few. Nick, in your recent policy paper with Amar, you mentioned the need for effective climate and weather data to know where we are headed in terms of climate and also react appropriately in terms of adaptation and early warning. The WMO UNDP UNEP SOF initiative aims to achieve the better data needed. Would you comment on this perhaps? Next question, how about promoting climate smart agriculture? This is very key because most of our forest covers in developing countries is being destroyed due to unsustainable land use practice like charcoal, bush burning, and clearing land for our agriculture expansion. Beyond securing the finance, it is very difficult to bring projects that invest in local level adaptation and really large scale. I would love to hear views on the panel on this. So I'll stop at this and see if we can maybe respond to these set of questions.
Can I try quickly?
Please.
First, Johannes Lind's question. I think that's extremely important. The adaptation, really effective adaptation and resilience really does depend on local knowledge. And even with big fancy computers and reasonably plausible models, getting the resolution that you need down at the local level for effective adaptation and resilience is really hard. And the value of that information is really high. So I do think that the doubling of the adaptation, which was agreed, finance, which was agreed in Glasgow, is very important, but it's extremely important it's used effectively. And I do think that the project that Johannes is talking about in the chat there is extremely important and would have very high returns as investment. And actually, it's a route down which we have to keep going. And I think it will be one of those areas where even much bigger computing power would be very valuable, as well as, of course, refinement in the analytics itself. It's not just the question of computing power and refinement of the local information. And we've seen, you know, over time, Bangladesh, and and in India, how valuable the good information can be. So that's a very strong yes to Yannick's question. The question about innovation, and I think also the question that Natasha was speaking to, and let me just give it an answer through agriculture. And obviously no time for long expositions, but just take mangroves. I mean, mangroves are very good for development and fishing and shrimps. Mangroves are very good at capturing carbon. They're very effective at capturing carbon, and they're very good at storm surges, dealing with storm surges and difficult. They're coastal protection. So these are examples. And if you take, the farmers of Nalanda in Bihar in India have been making tremendous progress on in systems of intensification for rice, the SRI rice, which stops. You don't flood the paddy fields, and you don't release the methane, and you save on the water, which is lower in energy, which is lowering your cost, and you grow in a way which is very productive and more resilient to difficult weather. So these are examples of. There are lots of other kinds of innovation we could speak to, but I thought I'll just give those examples of innovation because they have such powerful lessons in terms of the way in which development, mitigation, adaptation are bound up together, and show that experimentation can come from all sorts, not just in people's labs. So that, and lastly, on commitment and sanctions, I think one of the real breakthroughs in Paris was to move away from the slogan legally binding agreements. If you wind your mind back 10, 15 years, everybody was talking about legally binding agreements. Well, what do they mean? A police force in Mars and some kind of court in Jupiter. It's this is a story of countries getting together and making commitments to one another and to themselves, which are in large measure self-policed, but even police is the wrong word, self-enforced. And they come in large measure through the politics of their own country, through the politics of groups of countries getting together. And that's turned out to be a really fruitful advance, it seems to me, in international collaboration. And there are various different ways in which that can happen. I think now we're going to see the small island states, the more vulnerable developing countries, put pressure on the rich countries, first and foremost, but also on China and India to move faster because it matters to them. So I think we're talking about here commitment to each other, commitment to doing something of value rather than legally binding agreements anymore. There are some, when you sign up, that you do commit to. You commit to report in certain ways and at certain times. And you commit to certain kinds of measurement and you put in your target. But I think the narrow language of legally binding in terms of kind of some sanction mechanisms has quite helpfully moved to one side, and we've got something which is much more valuable. It doesn't mean that anything goes, of course. It doesn't mean that, because the political pressures within countries and between countries are very important. The collaboration across countries are very important, but it's a different kind of international agreement, and I think of great value.
Thank you so much for those responses, Lord Stern. Yannick, would you like to come on the first question from Karen?
Yeah, maybe echoing some of the words of Lord Stern, because I fully agree with him. Not surprisingly, we often agree with each other. It's with the Kyoto Protocol, we realized that actually we did not have the means to enforce the sanction that had been built in the Kyoto Protocol regime. I mean, the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change does not have an army to invade a country that decide not to respect the regime. And it's one of the reasons why it was very important to stop relying on the basically sanction regime built into international multilateral climate agreements. So does it mean that there is no sanction? There are actually two gigantic sanctions associated with not delivering on the Paris Agreement. The first sanction is a market sanction. If we all believe that we are speaking about the growth story of the 21st century. It means that we will have plenty of Kodak moment. Every single company, every single nation that will not embark on this journey will pay a terrible penalty. And and we often have the impression that 100% of the countries, 100% of the companies have to come on board for a market to basculate, to migrate. This is not true. Some market migrates with only 2 or 3 or 4% of the market shares. If you look, for example, at the automobile industry, we are not even at 3 or 4% of electric vehicles. But the automobile industry is in a total state of panic because they know that those who will not master the electric mobility technologies of tomorrow might not see the year 2030. Other markets, you will have to have 10% or 15% of the market actors to migrate, for the market to enter the market. But so this idea of sanction is often because there is a belief that 100% have to buy in, 100% have to move for a market to change. No, a market can change with only a fraction of the market participants, and it will change. The only, basically a company that does not embark toward on a low emission, or today no net zero emission, climate resilient development pathway, makes a bet that it's not to be the growth story of the 21st century, and in my view it's extremely risky, and it has the question of what is the alternative if it's not the growth story of the 21st century. Will a business thrive in a world that has failed? And so for me, a company or a government today that does not embark on a net zero emission climate resilient pathway will struggle a lot to come with a message of hope for its population and its stakeholder and shareholder, because what is your message of hope? What is your game plan if you do not embark? The second thing is that if you are a realist, if you belong to the international, if you belong to the political, to the school of political economy of realists, where only real hard power is important, yeah, you might think that the absence of sanction is a key issue. If you are a neo-institutionalist, if you belong to the school of political economy of neo-institutionalists, where basically through a number of different institutions, we create a lot of mutual dependency. I mean, there is a huge sanction. You do not play ball on climate. I'm not to trade with you. I'm not to have a security pact with you. And so I think we have actually some very, very strong incentives for following through on the multilateral climate agreements. Now, coming back to the Green Climate Fund, we support 4 transitions: the energy transition, the built environment transition, the natural environment transition, that means restoration and conservation, and the food security, human security transition. And because we believe that today, here again, the days where we could address climate change through the energy transition are over. Today we need to reinvent our farming system, and there is no real credible pathway toward net zero without large-scale ecosystem conservation and restoration. Now, in the field of energy, we focus on the optimization of grid and storage for renewable energy. Why optimization of grid and storage? Is because increasingly 98% of the money for independent power production for renewable energy comes from the private sector, because today renewable energy is the most financially attractive and the most scalable technologies that we have. You can build a solar park in 6 months. So it's both an extremely cost-effective technology with still a huge learning curve, and it's extremely scalable. And after, the other area where we work is energy efficiency and alternative fuel. Alternative fuel, it can be anything from green hydrogen to sustainable aviation fuel coming from municipal solid waste. Now, if you look at this energy paradigm that's result from the request we got from the countries we serve, de facto our energy paradigm is a world that's is 100% powered through renewable energy with different storage medium, including green hydrogen. And green hydrogen becomes also an alternative fuels for hard to decarbonize sectors such as logistics, cement, steels, and aluminium industries. That's the energy paradigm that's that's emerged from the projects we are currently supporting.
Thank you so much for that, Yannick. And with this, I would like to hand it over to Amar so that we can move to the next part of our discussion for today. Amar, over to you. Thank you.
Thank you, George. I know from the chat that there are many questions that we did not cover. We are going to be in a continuing conversation. The next part of this conversation is going to be focused on, an aspect that, we highlighted, but we have the benefit of a specific paper that Yannick Lemarek has prepared on innovation and investment. We heard about the tremendous contribution that investment and innovation can make, both on climate, but also on development at this point in time. But the reality is we are falling short on both. And so a clear understanding of what are the impediments that we are facing with regard to scaling up investment, with regard to the opportunities of innovation and unlocking, not only using the innovation we have, but unlocking future innovation. And with that, I don't have to reintroduce Yannick. He has a paper that he has prepared, which serves as the basis of his next presentation. But over to you, Yannick, and in the Q&A after Yannick's presentation, we can come back to some of the other issues that have been highlighted so far. Over to you, Yannick.
Thank you. Thanks a lot, Amar. So I will try to very quickly walk participants through the paper, but we'll encourage you to read it should you have any further questions. But in a sense, if we are to stay within the Paris Agreement's goals, we need to ensure that all the net zero targets that have been taken by countries over since 2018 are translated into action. And this, as I mentioned earlier, will require a dramatic scale up in finance and in investment in new asset classes. Next slide. Next slide. On paper, this should be happening. I think if we go back, no, the slide before, please. If we go back to the the discussion of the 130 trillion, if you can shift 2% of this 130 trillion toward the low emission climate resilient infrastructure, it should happen. And we should have a very good reason for doing so, because we have trillions of dollars in G20 countries that currently earn negative interest rate, while actually real return on infrastructure can be anywhere between 4 to 8%. And so we should see the money moving from this negative interest rate toward the $1 trillion of low emission climate resilient investment opportunities in developing countries. And this is not happening. And the reason for this paradox is that money does not only follow a return gradient, money follows a return risk gradient. And if your choice is either to take the risk of losing 100 of your capital by investing in the developing countries in a new type of climate resilient, low emission infrastructure, or losing 0.1% interest rate in your saving accounts, maybe you have better to stick to your minus 0.1%. And so one of the main tasks to ensure that we can shift $1 to $4 trillion a year toward low emission climate resilient infrastructure is to de-risk them, to reduce this perception of risk. It's we do not see the financial transfer for infrastructure. There is already a huge infrastructure gap in developing countries. When it comes to climate resilient, low emission infrastructure, the perception of risk is even higher, because when it comes to climate infrastructure, you often you often have much higher upfront capital expenditure, high capex, and that you swap for a much lower operation and maintenance, much lower OPEX, and at the end of the day, you can have an internal rate of return on your climate resilient low emission infrastructure that is extremely interesting, but your payback period compared to a conventional infrastructure will be much longer. And rather than having a payback period of 3 to 5 years, for example, you might need 7 to 10 years. The longer the payback period, the more you are exposed to a number of regulatory risk, macroeconomic risk, market risk, sovereign risk. In addition, when you speak about climate investment, you often speak about new technologies, new business model, and therefore you run the risk, for example, that you will be missing a very specific piece of regulation to be able to get your sitting license, or the risk that you will have to get an authorization from 27 different agencies. Therefore, the risk of overrun at the beginning of the project is much, much higher than with conventional infrastructure. So in essence, already the money is not flowing from OECD countries to developing countries for conventional infrastructure because of the high risk perception, and it's even less likely to flow for climate resilient low emission infrastructure because of the added risk associated with higher capex and lower and higher risk of cost overrun. Next one. And so in the paper, there is one chapter that tried to summarize all the different type of barriers to climate innovation and investment at the emergence, at the deployment, and at the adoption stages. I've divided them into 12 clusters of barriers. Each time an investor has perceived potential barriers, basically the investors will increase the cost of financing as a compensation for that perceived risk. And at the end, we end up with financing costs which are completely unbearable. Why you can get you can get financing in OECD countries for what, 3% maybe amount nowadays. In developing countries, often you are north of 20%. So all these barriers and the risk that arise from the barriers generate an unbelievable risk premium in terms of the cost of financing, which makes even the most attractive investment in a low financing cost environment absolutely unaffordable in a high financing cost environment. Next one. The AMA, you were mentioning carbon pricing, you were mentioning sectoral policies. There are more than 5,000 climate policies currently used across the world in order to de-risk climate resilient low emission investment. And if there is one thing that the Green Climate Fund has learned from its experience, is that you have no magical bullet. You have no one-size-fits-all solution. In each country, it will be important to come with a unique portfolio of environmental policy instruments to address the unique barriers and the unique risk. And the good news is that most of these instruments are mutually supportive. For example, carbon pricing takes time to make a difference. And you have to reach extremely high level of carbon pricing before basically the market takes notice. And the higher the level of carbon pricing, the lower the political willingness of people to accept this kind of prices. On the other hand, if you can come with sectoral policies, such as, for example, feed-in tariff or power purchase agreement or bans or land zoning or whatever, you can actually dramatically reduce the level of carbon taxation to obtain an impact. And so for us, one of our key lessons is that in every single country, we will have to identify what is the best set of instruments to de-risk climate resilient, low emission investment. Next slide. So in line with this analysis, GCF has adopted a four-pronged approach. The first one is that we support developing countries' effort to put in place a conducive environment for scaling up climate action. And it's up to the countries to decide what does it mean for them, a conducive environment for scaling up climate action. It can be basically finalizing the overall regulatory framework for climate action. Bloomberg Energy estimates that a country with a fully fledged regulatory environment can attract up to 7 times more domestic and international investment than a country with an incomplete set of policies. But it can be developing a new institution, such as, for example, a green bank, or it can be developing an innovative financing mechanism. It's up to the countries to, or it can be developing integrated climate strategies and policies. We believe that the total cost for infrastructure, the total financial requirement for infrastructure can be reduced by up to 40% if we adopt an integrated strategic and policy approach. And if we treat, for example, water, land and energy as part of the same problematic, rather than trying to come with a plan for water, a plan for energy, and a plan for land. The second prong of our four-prong approach is to catalyze the innovation. And there it can be anything between basically supporting incubators and accelerators. There are very, very few incubators and accelerators in developing countries to support climate innovators to refine their business model and develop a functional solution. But this can be also providing early growth financing. There is a dearth of early growth financing to climate innovators to reach markets. And for that, we are developing a number of what we call specialty financing for different type of innovation. We have, for example, funds that provide equity to SMEs involved in climate resilient agriculture in Africa to test the new approaches. Now, once we have a functional solution that has been piloted and tested, how do we reach scale? How do we reach commercial scale? Reaching commercial scale is extremely important because the bankers cannot deal with uncertainty. They can deal with risk because they price risk. They cannot deal with uncertainty. If your business is uncertain, your banker will say no. If your business is risky, your banker will price the cost of money. And if we want to scale up a new climate solution, we have to establish a commercial track record that will enable bankers to basically assess risk and price the cost of money. And so under this third prong, what we do is that we de-risk through blended finance the first movers, the first projects that will establish a commercial track record for a new climate solution and create a new market. And I will give some example of this type of blended finance soon. But blended finance, for those who will not be familiar with, is that basically you use public money that you blend with private money to de-risk the overall investment. And the fourth one, once you have your commercial solution at scale, is how do you basically accelerate the widespread adoption of your new climate solution? For that, you need to deepen. You need to strengthen. You need to deepen domestic market, and you need to strengthen national, public, and private financial institution. Finance is parochial. We are parochial as investors. We will invest in the people, in the geography, in the technology we know. Every time we are asked to invest in people or geographies or technologies that we don't know, we will basically dramatically increase our price premium. And therefore, if we want to scale up, we need to make sure that we dramatically strengthen the capacity of national public bank, national commercial banks. And for that, GCF basically help this national institution in developing the technical skills needed to originate their first set of climate investment, and in accessing domestic and international markets to finance them. And this can be, for example, helping them in issuing their first green bond or resilience bond. Next slide. So this is our four-prong. It's our overall approach to basically scale up, to facilitate the emergence and scale up a new climate innovation. A new climate solution. I would like to take to illustrate how it can work in practice for an entire area and an entire geography. I will take the example of climate resilient infrastructure. You will recall that I mentioned during my first intervention that right now we are doubling the amount of money allocated to adaptation. It's not to address the $1 to $4 trillion in climate investment gap for climate resilient low emission infrastructure. And so GCF has been working for now a little bit more than 1 year with a coalition of private and public sector institutions, CCRI, to develop a new methodology to catalyze finance for climate resilient infrastructure, where we could mobilize the hundreds and hundreds of billions of dollars that we need. And so this methodology basically starts with conducting a systemic resilience assessment. We are right now piloting it, for example, in Jamaica. The Prime Minister Holness from Jamaica had mentioned it in his opening remarks at COP26. And so what we do there is that we try to overlay all the critical infrastructure, those that cannot go offline in the after a hurricane, after climate-related extreme weather events, and with the hazard, with the map of different hazards. And so that's enabled us to identify the infrastructure that have to be immediately protected, and the ones and the services that have to be protected. And once this is done, the second step is to identify the optimal mix of gray and green infrastructure to increase the overall resilience of the entire system. And we know that, for example, green infrastructure can be a much more powerful solution in a number of cases than gray infrastructure, and they tend to be badly overlooked. Lord Stern mentioned mangroves. Mangroves play countless role in terms of livelihood, in terms of carbon sequestration, and in terms of resilience from extreme weather events. And so there, the idea is to come with the optimal mix of gray and green infrastructure for a given geography. And once we have the gray infrastructure, it's after to help investors in basically incorporating physical and transition risk into the assessment of the infrastructure. And what we have found is that in almost every single climate scenario, the internal rate of return are much higher for climate compatible, climate resilient, low emission infrastructure than conventional infrastructure. And one of the reasons why investors are still investing in conventional infrastructure is because most of our investment appraisal methodologies are obsolete. And there we try to basically come with new investment appraisal methodologies that mainstream physical, climate physical and transition risk. And the third and last step, once you have done that, is to basically engineer access to long-term affordable finance for climate resilient infrastructure. And there I would like to come back to my point about grant, because sovereign debt is not the solution anymore in a number of countries. The idea is that you come with all your projects, and you look at the projects that are bankable with only policy de-risking. Policy de-risking is relatively cheap compared to financial de-risking. And so there you can use grant to put in place a policy framework and to de-risk projects that with only long-term policy commitment are bankable. After you have the second type of projects, that's the projects with basically where you need to use public money, you need to blend public money with private money to de-risk the private investment and make the project bankable. More expensive, but critical for a second type of project. And the third one are the projects that will have to be financed by public money. And there the question is that what kind of public finance can be used? And notably, what kind of innovative financing instruments could we leverage in order to finance climate action without increasing the debt burdens of developing countries? And for example, one of the ideas that has been floated repeatedly at COP26 was to use the SDRs to finance part of this efforts. The SDRs is basically overnight interest rate ad vitam aeternam. So it's an extremely concessional level of finance. We hope that by COP27, we will have already a couple of similar exercise completed, so that we can have a discussion on how we can scale up finance, not only for mitigation, but also for adaptation. How we can use $100 billion in a highly catalytic manner to shift 1 to 4 trillion. And my last slide. Next. For those who would be interested, I would like to invite you to have a look at some of the latest example of blended finance we have been supporting. The traditional blended finance does not work for the poor, does not work for adaptation, does not work for ecosystem-based solution. It basically works mostly for mature technologies in mature markets. And so GCF is capital agnostic. We are financing grant, but we can convert the grant into any kind of grant, non-grant instruments. So it can be extension of the tenor for a loan, but it can be guarantees, it can be equities. And we are also partner agnostic. We are a partnership organization. We work with more than 200 institutions in the world, from some of the largest commercial banks such as Deutsche Bank or BNP Paribas or Mitsubishi Bank, to civil society organization at the community level. And what we have discovered is that the fact that we are capital agnostic, the fact that we are partner agnostic, the fact that our board is willing to take risk if the return in terms of climate impact is commensurate, enable us to try completely new type of blended finance. And so one example that I would like to take is, For example, the Sustainable Renewable Risk Mitigation Initiative that we have with World Bank, there it's to increase energy access to 5 African countries. The projects invest in basically optimizing the grids and optimizing storage capacity, and all the money for the independent power production will come from the private sector. And so the project is, if my memory is correct, $280 million in grant from GCF in grant, loan and guarantees, and $1.3 billion from World Bank, and we hope to mobilize at least $5 billion from the private sector. And so what we did is that we basically use our grant for policy development, use guarantees to guarantee investment from the independent power producer. Now, and gives them access to long-term affordable finance. Why is guarantee such a powerful solution? It's right now, according to OECD, it's right now the most powerful instrument that we have to catalyze finance at scale in developing countries. Why is it so powerful? The reason is because you might have noticed that when I was speaking about risk, I was mentioning perceived risk, not mentioning real risk. Because we are parochial, we tend to put a very high risk premium the less familiar we are with geography and with technology. And when you look at the default rate, there is no correlation between the default rates and the price premium. And actually the default rates in developing countries are not much higher than the default rates in OECD countries. They are marginally higher and definitely not of a nature to justify a price premium that jumped from 3 to 20%. And when you use guarantees, you basically reassure bankers that they will get their money. And if, because the default rate are not correlated with the price premium, most of the time your guarantees will not be needed. And well-managed guarantee funds basically have default rate of 7, 8, 9%. So there you have a huge leveraging ratio. The second type of projects and the second type of instrument is private equity or public equity if it's come from a sovereign fund or pension fund. And after guarantees, we have found that it's the most powerful instruments to catalyze finance at scale. And private equity basically enables you to put a bit of skin on the table and therefore is reassure your banker. And so with private equity, you can basically much more easily get finance from a bank. And this example, it's a $750 million private equity fund that's that is to finance adaptation and mitigation projects at the subnational level, projects between $5 to $50 million, the type of projects that never get financed normally. It's next to impossible to get private equity for climate. It's next to impossible for climate investment. It's next to impossible to get climate equity at the subnational level, and next to impossible to get climate equity for LDCs and seeds. In the case of this project, 50% of the participating countries are LDCs and seeds. How did we achieve this? It's basically GCF provided $150 million of first loss equity. It's the first to lose our money are us. And this was enough to reassure sovereign investors, institutional investors to come in as senior equity providers. And in addition, we also allocated some money in the form of grant for originating projects that's are good for climate and good and provide a lot of development cost benefit. And this should ensure an adequate deal flow. And so in this project, we ended up using private equity and grant. And in this project is implemented by a private equity firm, a multilateral organization, a civil society organization. And there's an example of the type of new forms of blended finance that we are exploring by leveraging the fact that we are capital agnostic and partner agnostic. We can use the type of instruments needed by a project, not only the type of, and so we are not looking for projects that can that can absorb our type of finance, but we are looking at the type of finance that the project needs, and we can create unprecedented coalition. In our efforts to create systemic resilience, we believe that these instruments will be particularly critical. I will stop here now.
Thank you very much, Yannick. And I thought those last two examples on the finance side are precisely the kinds of instruments that one needs, which are, targeted at specific areas and particularly targeted to those countries that have the most difficult, of course, difficulties in accessing finance. So I just want to check with our audience. We have about 10 minutes, not actually even 10 minutes. And I'd like to see if there are any specific questions that are addressed to Yannick. There's a question, Yannick, about the paper, whether it's accessible, and if George, you could put the link on the chat, that would be very, very helpful. I do have a question myself, Yannick. As you very correctly, in my view, highlighted, there are a large number of potential impediments, that arise in ultimately, unlocking investment projects and in unlocking finance and making the connection between the two. And this tends to be quite country specific, as you pointed out. Now, during COP26, there was therefore a lot of discussion about country platforms. As you know, Makani pushing at it very much from a private sector point of view. Some of us have been pushing it, including in the context of the G20 Eminent Persons Group, more from a country perspective and a sector perspective. And in his last press conference, Boris Johnson very much emphasized now the importance of country platforms as a way to kind of solving these connections, but in a very country sector specific way. South Africa is a very interesting case of such a country platform. The Presidential Commission that came up with a program, and now the political declaration is a way to try and bring together at scale the country and the international community around a particular purpose, tackling the policy and institutional impediments, bringing in the private sector at the ground level, and using, in some sense, mobilizing the finance that is necessary in the right kind of blended structure. How much potential do you think there is for that approach? And it's something I know that GCF had thought about also quite early. It's not something completely new. I was very much part of those discussions. But the world community now seems to be coming together around this. So what potential do you see now of using that approach to help us to go to scale? That is a question from me. I'm just trying to see if there are any questions from our audience. If you raise your hand or you put your question in your chat. But while we do that, maybe Yannick, it gives you an opportunity to elaborate on something I know that you think about anyway.
Amma, as you know, I'm 100% in favor of country platforms. First, I think we don't have the time anymore for individual projects. The part of scaling up will include to move from individual projects to basically syndicated platforms where you bring different players with different financing instruments together in order to reach scale. At COP26, GCF with the Asian Development Bank and the European Union, UK, and I think Germany, I believe, launched the Asean Green Recovery Platform. And the idea of this platform, it's to basically leverage north of $10 billion of private investment in order to de-risk the higher upfront cost of green infrastructure in ASEAN countries. And so we know that after a disaster, such be a hurricane or a global pandemic, people do not build back better. They build back worse, actually, because they don't have the money to build back better. And there will be a huge temptation to try to come with plenty of job-creating infrastructure projects that actually are not climate resilient and low emission. And so the ASEAN Green Recovery Platform will basically address the issue of higher upfront cost and higher risk of cost overrun, upfront cost overrun. And so for that, we brought several donors together with several countries with different type of instruments. We are right now working on the climate resilient recovery platform for the Caribbean, and it's very likely that we will increasingly act as a kind of syndicator for establishing platforms, different type of platforms, coalition of different groups of people with different capacity, different risk appetites. The country platform is one option, and in some other case, you want on the opposite to have a global platform. For example, when you speak about we have launched a project of private equity fund for coral reef. There, it's a global project. It's a platform, but it's a global with countries from all across the world, because you want to dramatically reduce increase your country diversification and reduce your country risk. Same thing if you go for guarantees, you might not wish to have only one country in your guarantee platform. You might wish to have several countries. So we will most likely need combinations of thematic platforms and country platforms.
Thank you very much, Yannick. I think I'm told that we don't have enough time, because we have a closing part which my colleague George will organize. I know that there are a couple of questions. If you could send us your questions, we'll be glad to, between George and myself, to respond to them. We will be very glad to share Yannick's presentation and the paper that is underpinning it. But we want to kind of close right now on the discussion, and for that, let me turn it back to George.
And before turning back, Emma, I would like to deeply thank you. It was such a pleasure to have this session with you.
No, it was. On the contrary, I think there's been so much food for thought that you have put out there. I had read the earlier version of the paper. I really look forward to reading this, and I think you have set us a really good agenda, not just for now, but as you said, on the road to COP27. So really look forward to staying engaged with you and through the practice on making a difference on the scaling up for climate action. And as you said, we tackling all four gaps that we face. If I could now turn it over to you, George.
Thank you so much, Amar, and thank you very much, Yannick, for your very insightful presentation. Now, we would like to invite Robert from Flatland, if Robert's here with us, to give us a summary of the visual notes he has taken of this meeting. That would be one creative way of summarizing our discussion, and then we'll come back to you in a minute. Over to you, Robert.
Yes, I'm here, George. Thank you. I was just finishing up the last pen strokes. Let me see. I will grab my screen. Here it is. Okay, if I'm correct, you're now seeing my screen and hearing me as well.
That is correct.
Perfect. Okay, so I will dive in. I've been listening quietly in the background to all the beautiful presentations and musings of the recap of what the COP26 was about. I will start in the left-hand corner and will chronologically walk you through what I have picked up from all of the speakers and the discussion. So we started off with Amalie, who was talking about her 3 main points that she took away from COP26. I wrote them down here as 1, 2, 3, which was first to follow through on the existing commitments. So from what I understand is that there is still a lot of money left to be used to battle climate change. So follow through on those already existing commitments. Make the accessibility of funding right to conduct the adaptation that is wished for. So a lot of developing nations are struggling with the adaptation, but there are funds available. So make those funds accessible so that the adaptation can take place. And third and final was also the big focus on the forward process. So with an active participation, I heard that from most of the speakers that there is now a real participation from the private sector and from the real economy, and that might accelerate and come to fruition on battling climate change. Then the next, I think my screen is loading. The next talk from Amar, beautiful talk again. What I visualized here, for me, the most takeaway message was the scaling up part. So getting from a sapling to a full-grown tree, and he noted it down in 4 key points. So cooperate around ambition, make sure that the ambition is aligned and cooperate around that. The solution lies in investment and innovation, also something that Yannick dove deeper into. Have a systematic approach and realize the importance of finance. Then going on to Yannick, he was talking about the 4 gaps and actually the 3 gaps, and the 4th one that appeared during COP26 is the trust gap. It's really imperative to close all those gaps, and a few main things was to have a catalytic approach and to invest in new asset classes. Then on to the musings of Lord Nicholas Stern. Thank you, Lord Nicholas. It was interesting to listen. Lord Nicholas was talking about creating the right investment climate. So having money available, but not having the proper partnerships, the proper legislation to find all the right places. I'm hearing some background noise. If somebody might mute their microphone, thank you. So what I was talking about, the right investment climate, create that. And Lord Nicholas talked about his 3 key points. One was scaling. So in terms of scaling up, we've realized that an increase of 2 degrees is too much. So we need to aim for 1.5 degrees, and that requires a lot of scaling. The net zero announcement that involves not just single nations and single people, but it involves practically everyone. So that amounts to or accelerates the scaling. And the realization that the scope is just bigger than the temperature change. It also includes the biodiversity, scarcity of resources, and so on. Now, the players, again, I heard from Lord Nicholas that he also found it encouraging and interesting that the private sector has now joined the effort, which should lead to more actions. And in terms of actions, you can see here visualization of the bag of money that is trying to get to the top of the mountain, the goal that we're trying to achieve, or the goals that we're trying to achieve. The big part is in finding that road to get the funds to where they are needed and executed well. Then going on to the last part, Yannick gave the presentation, and the main thing I took away was the four-pronged approach to helping, mitigating the risk of investment and getting money from developed nations to developing countries. Was to use transformational planning, have a catalysis in place for innovation, whereby there is an established, I see it as a sort of nourishing ground in which to innovation can flourish. Mobilizing finance through the use of blended finance, so coupling government finance with private sector money, also again to mitigate the risk and make the funds go where they need to be. And lastly, aligning finance with sustainable development. It's all about getting to market and build on the efforts. So that was what I took away, and around that, let me zoom out a bit again so you can see the whole overview. Around that, there is the environment. For me, it's you see a lot of movement. It's about trying to get the planet to a better place. So I'm really happy to be part of this and to hear all the efforts that you're busy with. So thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Robert. It's great to have you with us once again. Really appreciate your creativity and thinking. It must be very hard not only to draw, but think so carefully while you draw. Amazing.
It was a fast-paced meeting, but I had a lot of fun.
Thank you so much for joining us, and we will post it on our webpage under the events section, where you can find more information about this event, as well as Scaling Up Community of Practice webpage. So the presentation and the visual notes will be presented there. With this and without further delay, we have kept you all here for quite some time. We thank you for joining today. The Community of Practice and its core members will convene the next meeting in the spring. Amar, I hope that's gonna happen in 2022. And we look forward to meeting you all again in the spring, and of course for the annual event next year this time. Thank you, Yannick. Thank you, Amar, Johannes, Larry, Natalie, Erde, Paul, Anna, Flavio, and everyone who's supported this event. We really appreciate your participation and your strong support throughout. Have a good morning, evening, afternoon, wherever you guys are. Goodbye.
Thank you, George.